welcome to another deep dive. We're going to try to understand culture today.
Okay.
And you have brought some really interesting stuff for us to dig into.
Yeah.
We've got some presentation slides on teaching culture and critical thinking.
Right.
We have a research article about how culture shows up in a textbook,
Okay.
an EFL textbook.
Yeah.
And then some theoretical stuff about intercultural communication.
Uh-huh.
And this really interesting distinction between big C culture and little c culture and identity.
Yeah. That's going to be fun to unpack.
So that is our mission today.
Awesome.
We're going to try to distill all of that down and hopefully give you a shortcut to understanding
I like it.
the many complexities of culture.
All right.
So let's jump right in.
Okay.
When we say culture, what are we really talking about?
Well, I think oftentimes the first things that people think about are, a country's literature or its geography or art.
Right.
And that is definitely part of it. And that kind of falls into the category of what we call big C culture. So, the kind of formal institutional aspects of culture like history, art, literature, systems of government.
Yeah.
So the things that a country is known for.
Yeah.
But what's equally important and maybe even more important for interacting with people
Right.
is what we call little c culture.
Okay.
And this is where the sources get really interesting.
Yeah.
So this is the informal everyday stuff like beliefs, values, how people communicate with each other, social norms.
Right.
Even, things like how you greet someone or what's considered polite
Yeah.
at the dinner table.
Okay.
So all that underlying stuff that makes up our daily lives.
I'm thinking about that iceberg analogy
Yes.
that we saw in one of the readings.
Exactly.
Like the tip of the iceberg is all that big C stuff.
Yeah.
The formal institutions,
Uh-huh.
but all that invisible stuff
Right.
underneath the surface.
Yeah.
The values and the communication styles.
Absolutely.
That's the little c stuff, and that's the stuff that really...
That's where the weight is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our communication style, our beliefs about what's right and wrong,
Right.
the values that guide our decisions, all that stuff that we don't always see,
Yeah.
but really affects how we connect with other people.
Right. Or don't connect.
Or don't connect, exactly.
Yeah.
I thought Tomlin and Stemplewski had a really helpful model for this.
Oh, yeah?
They broke down culture into these three categories.
Okay.
Products, behaviors, and ideas.
Okay.
The products are the tangible stuff like music and art.
Yeah.
Behaviors are like customs and habits.
Uh-huh.
And then ideas are those underlying beliefs and values.
Right.
And then we also saw that model from,
Uh-huh.
oh gosh, I can't remember their names now.
Okay.
Hello and Lazar.
Hello and Lazar.
Yeah, and they had a tripartite model.
Yes.
Civilization behavior and speech patterns and discourse.
Right.
So all of that is important. And like Bennett said,
Yeah.
you can be fluent in a language.
Right.
But if you don't understand the cultural context,
He calls it being a fluent fool.
a fluent fool, right?
So you can speak perfectly,
Right.
but totally miss the mark
Yeah.
in your communication.
Okay, so we've established that this deep understanding of both big C and little c culture is really important.
Yeah.
But why is it important to teach this?
Well,
Especially in the context of language learning.
yeah.
That's what Andy Noonan's slides were about.
Yeah, Noonan's presentation makes a really strong case for this.
Okay.
And one of the key benefits he talks about is, looking at the students' own home cultures.
Okay.
So, encouraging them to examine their own cultural background.
So not just the target culture.
Right. Not just focusing on, British or American culture, but actually
Right.
thinking critically about their own norms and values.
Yeah.
And that ability to reflect on your own culture, I think, is so important for understanding other cultures.
Yeah, because if you can kind of hold up a mirror to your own,
Yeah.
you can understand how your own culture works. Exactly.
And then you can start to understand other cultures better.
You can approach a new culture with more curiosity and sensitivity rather than just, imposing your own cultural framework on it.
Right.
Noonan also talks about the benefits of using frameworks for teaching culture.
Okay.
And this is something that I found really helpful in my own teaching.
Yeah.
Frameworks just give you a really nice structured way to approach cultural topics.
Right.
And it helps to ensure that you are considering all the different facets of a culture.
Okay.
And it also helps students develop those critical thinking skills
Okay.
that they need to navigate a globalized world.
So they can analyze any culture that they come into contact with.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So it's not just about memorizing facts about a particular culture. It's
Mhm.
about developing that mental toolkit that you can use
Yeah, yeah.
to analyze any culture.
Okay, so what are some of those frameworks?
So Noonan's presentation introduced two main ones. Um, the first one was Moran's cultural elements framework.
Okay.
And this breaks culture down into 5 elements.
Okay.
Products, practices, persons, communities, and perspectives.
Okay, can you break those down a little bit more for us?
Sure. So products are the tangible things that a culture creates.
Okay.
So, things like food, clothing, tools,
I know,
technology.
material culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Practices are the things that people do.
Fine.
So, customs, rituals, communication styles, ways of interacting with each other.
Yeah.
Persons are the individuals within a culture.
Okay.
And this element really emphasizes, the roles that people play
Mm-hmm.
and the relationships between individuals.
Okay.
Communities are the groups of people who share common practices and perspectives.
Okay.
So, families, religious groups, social clubs.
Right.
And then perspectives are the underlying beliefs, values, and attitudes that shape a culture.
Okay.
So you know what is considered right and wrong,
Yeah.
what is important, what is beautiful.
Okay, so if we're looking at a specific cultural phenomenon,
Yeah,
we can kind of analyze it through all those 5 different lenses.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that gives us a more complete picture of it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then what was that other framework?
So the other one was the cultural knowings framework.
Okay.
And this is based on Kolb's experiential learning cycle.
Okay.
And it focuses more on the process of learning about culture.
Okay.
So it involves these 4 stages.
Yeah.
Knowing about knowing oneself and knowing why.
Okay, what are those?
So knowing how is about participating in a cultural practice.
Okay.
Actually doing something or observing it being done.
Right.
Knowing about is about describing what happened.
Okay.
Being able to articulate the details of the practice.
Yeah.
Knowing oneself is about reflecting on your own reactions and feelings.
Okay.
How did this practice make you feel? Did it challenge your assumptions? And then knowing why is about interpreting the cultural practice from both an insider and an outsider perspective. So, trying to understand the underlying reasons for the practice.
Yeah.
And comparing it to your own cultural background.
So really like a much deeper analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, so we have these frameworks.
Yeah.
And then one of the sources you brought was a research article about the Headway textbook series.
Yeah.
And they look at how big C and little c culture are actually presented in the books.
Uh-huh.
So what were the main findings there?
So they basically went through all the vocabulary lists in the books.
Okay.
And they coded each word or phrase as either big C or little c.
Okay.
And the biggest finding was that little c culture got a lot of attention across all levels of the textbooks.
So from like beginner to advanced.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that makes sense because, language learners need to be able to function in everyday situations.
Right.
They need to know how to greet people,
Yeah.
order food, get around.
Right.
But they also found that big C culture got more emphasis as learners progressed to higher levels.
Okay.
So, the beginner books focused more on basic vocabulary like
Right.
food and clothing.
Yeah.
But the advanced books introduced more complex topics like art history literature.
Okay, so as they build their language skills,
Right.
they can tackle more complex cultural topics.
Exactly.
Okay, did they look at any specific themes within big C or little c?
Yeah, they did.
What do they find?
So within big C culture, the most common themes were education and art.
Okay.
And then within little c culture, the most common themes were everyday living and interpersonal relations.
Okay.
And then the other framework that they mentioned in the article
Yeah.
was Cortazzi's cultural content integration framework.
Okay.
And this framework looks at the balance of different cultural perspectives in teaching materials.
Okay.
And so there's source culture, which is the culture of the learner,
Right.
target culture, which is the culture they're learning about, and then international culture, which is, broader global perspectives.
Right.
And so the Headway study, didn't specifically focus on this framework,
Right.
but it's relevant because it shows that Headway seems to take a more balanced approach
Okay.
to cultural content than some other textbooks.
Okay.
Because some textbooks have been criticized for overemphasizing the target culture
Right.
or for focusing too much on big C culture.
Okay, so Headway seems to be doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, it seems like they're trying to give learners a good mix of both.
Okay, cool. So we talked about big C and little c.
Yeah.
But how do those things interact with individual identity?
Well, that's where the pasted text source gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because it talks about how big C culture really provides a framework
Yeah.
for understanding little c culture.
Okay.
So, big C culture is like the historical and social context
Right.
that shapes the way people behave in their everyday lives.
Okay.
So, for example, if a country has a long history of valuing harmony, right?
Then that's probably going to be reflected in the way people communicate with each other.
Yeah.
They might be more indirect, or they might be more likely to avoid conflict.
Right.
And so when people from different big C cultures interact,
Yeah.
that's where you can get these misunderstandings,
Right.
because their little key cultures might be really different.
Yeah.
And the source gives some really good examples of this.
Okay. Like what?
Well, like, different communication styles.
Okay.
So, some cultures are really direct,
Yeah.
and they say exactly what they mean.
Uh-huh.
But other cultures are more indirect,
Yeah.
and they might beat around the bush a little bit.
Right. Right.
And so if you're not aware of those differences,
Yeah.
it can lead to a lot of confusion.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Another example is individualism versus collectivism.
Okay.
So, some cultures really value individual achievement,
Right.
and they encourage people to stand out from the crowd.
Yeah.
But other cultures are more collectivist,
Uh-huh.
and they emphasize the importance of the group.
Yeah.
And so if you're from an individualist culture and you're working with people from a collectivist culture,
Right.
you might find that they're not as assertive,
Well.
or they might be more hesitant to take risks.
Right.
And that can be frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you understand the big C cultural context,
Yeah.
it can help you to make sense of those little C differences.
Right. So you can kind of see where they're coming from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can also help you to be more patient and understanding
Right.
when you're interacting with people from different cultures.
Yeah. And I really like how the pasted text source talked about those two different sides of identity.
Yeah.
The inherited side and then the creative side.
Right. So the inherited side is the stuff that we get from our big C culture.
Yeah.
It's our background, our history, our values.
Mm-hmm.
And then the creative side is how we express ourselves within that context.
And so, we all have this inherited side to our identity,
Right.
but we can be creative in how we express it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's really important to remember
Yeah.
when we're interacting with people from different cultures.
Because we can't assume
Yeah,
that they're going to express their culture in the same way.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's also that concept of block narratives versus thread narratives,
Yes.
which I thought was really interesting.
Explain that.
So block narratives are those kind of like stereotypical views of a culture,
Right.
The kind of things that you might read in a tourist guide.
Yeah.
And they can be really unhelpful because they reduce a culture down to a few simple characteristics.
Yeah. Yeah.
But thread narratives are more nuanced.
Okay.
They're based on shared meanings and individual experiences.
Right.
And so they're much more accurate.
Yeah.
And they're also much more respectful.
Right. Because they recognize the complexity of culture.
Exactly. And then the source also talked about Birkenstedt's identity theory, which is this idea that our identities are basically sets of meanings that guide our actions.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly seeking to verify those meanings in our interactions with other people.
Yeah.
And so culture really shapes those meanings.
Right.
It tells us who we are and
Yeah.
how we're supposed to behave.
Right.
And so when we interact with people from different cultures,
Yeah.
those meanings can get challenged.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that can be a really uncomfortable experience,
Yeah.
but it can also be a really valuable learning experience if
Yeah.
we're open to it.
Okay. So understanding the big picture of a culture
Yeah.
can help us understand those little everyday interactions.
Right. And it can also help us to be more aware of our own cultural biases.
Right.
And so the sources actually gave some really good examples of this.
Like what?
Well, like the success of Starbucks in China, they really adapted their menu to the local culture.
Yeah.
They started offering tea.
Right.
And they changed the design of their stores to be more in line with Chinese aesthetics.
Okay.
And so that was a really successful example of
Okay.
a company understanding and respecting the local culture.
Right.
And then another example was IBM.
Yeah. Okay.
They invested a lot of money in cross-cultural training for their employees.
Okay.
And that helped to improve communication and collaboration across different cultures within the company.
Right.
And so that's a really good example of how businesses can benefit
Yeah.
from investing in cultural understanding.
Okay. And then I remember the research article also proposed a model
Yeah.
for integrating culture into language teaching.
Right.
Can you remind me what that was?
Yeah, so it's called the Sustainable Cyclic Vocabulary Teaching Model.
Okay.
And it's basically a cycle of 5 steps.
Okay.
The first step is selecting vocabulary. That's relevant to both big C and little c culture.
Okay.
The second step is providing opportunities for experiential learning.
Right.
So, actually having students go out and experience the culture firsthand.
Okay.
The third step is reflection.
Okay.
So, encouraging students to think about their experiences and
Yeah.
to connect them to the vocabulary they've learned.
Uh-huh.
The fourth step is reinforcement.
Okay.
So, providing students with opportunities to practice using the vocabulary in
Right.
different contexts.
Yeah.
And then the fifth step is assessment.
Okay.
And so the goal is to assess both language proficiency and cultural competence.
Right.
So it's a really holistic approach to teaching culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we have covered a lot today.
We have.
But the key takeaway, I think, is that culture is really complex.
Absolutely.
It's not just about, the big C stuff, like the history and the art. It's also about the little c stuff.
The everyday stuff.
Yeah, the everyday stuff.
Stuff that we don't always think about.
Yeah, yeah.
But that really shapes our interactions with other people.
Right. And understanding both is really important.
Absolutely.
Especially in today's world.
Yeah.
Where we're all so interconnected.
Exactly.
So hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding
I hope so.
of all those different facets of culture.
Yeah, me too.
And, I would encourage you to think about a recent interaction
Yeah.
where you felt some kind of cultural difference or maybe a little bit of miscommunication,
Yeah.
and try to analyze that interaction
Right.
through the lens of the frameworks we've talked about today.
Yeah. What new questions does that raise for you?
Exactly.
I like it.
So that is all the time we have today.
Okay.
But thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the world of culture.
It was fun.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.